Mara Delacroix had always believed that the most dangerous thing a person could do was ignore a story. Not the kind of story told around dinner tables or passed between friends. She meant the old kind, the kind carved into stone, whispered in dead languages, buried in books that no one had opened in 100 years. That was the kind of story that held real power, and that was exactly the kind of story that had brought her to the edge of Iron Vale. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the mountains were wrapped in cold gray mist, and the trees had already lost most of their leaves. The village was small and quiet. Wooden houses lined a single main road, and at the far end of that road, the forest began. It rose up from the earth like a wall, tall and dark and absolute. The locals called it the Valewood. They spoke the name softly, the way people speak about something they respect deeply, and fear even more. Mara had rented a room above a bakery from a woman named Petra, who had kind eyes and a habit of folding her hands together whenever she was about to say something important. On that first evening, Petra sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded her hands. "You are here for the old stories," Petra said. It was not a question. "I am," Mara said. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The forest is forbidden. No one enters without permission from the Alpha King, and he does not give permission, not to anyone. Not in many years." Mara thanked her for the warning. She meant it sincerely. Then she went upstairs, opened her bag, and took out the book. It was a small thing, barely larger than her hand, with a cover so worn that the original color was impossible to determine. She had found it 3 years ago, at an estate sale outside of Lyon, tucked between 2 water-damaged encyclopedias. Most of the text was in a dialect so old that even specialist linguists had looked at photographs of the pages and shaken their heads. Mara had translated it herself, slowly and imperfectly, over 2 years of evenings and weekends. What she had found inside had changed the direction of her research entirely. The book contained names, not ordinary names, old names, in the old tradition, given not to people but to spirits. Specifically, to the spirit wolves said to walk the boundary between the world of the living and the world of what came before. According to the text, these wolves had existed since before human memory. They were not dangerous, they were guardians, and they could only be seen by those who knew how to call them properly. Mara had practiced the names for months. She did not know if she believed in spirit wolves. She was a researcher. She believed in evidence. But she had come to Iron Vale because the book described a forest by this exact name, in these exact mountains, and she wanted to see what she could find. She told herself that was all. She woke before sunrise the next morning, dressed in layers against the cold, and walked to the edge of the village. The boundary markers were easy enough to identify, large flat stones pressed into the earth, each one carved with symbols that matched illustrations in her book. She stood at the line between the village and the forest for a long moment. The trees were dark ahead of her. The mist moved between them like something breathing. She stepped forward. The change was immediate and impossible to explain. It was not that the forest looked different. It was that it felt different. The air had a weight to it, a stillness that was not quite natural. Her footsteps sounded too loud and then, after a few minutes of walking, not loud enough. Her compass, which she had thought to bring as a practical precaution, began to spin slowly and would not stop. She kept walking. She had been in the forest for perhaps 20 minutes when she saw them. There were 3 of them, standing between 2 pale-barked trees no more than 15 meters ahead. They were wolves, but not the kind she had ever seen in a photograph or a nature documentary. They were large, much larger than any wolf she knew to exist, and their fur had a quality to it that she could not immediately describe. It was as though the edges of each animal were slightly soft, slightly uncertain, the way the edges of things look in a photograph taken just a moment too late. Their eyes were silver, fully silver, like old mirrors. They did not move. They watched her. Mara's heart was beating very fast. She stood completely still and breathed slowly, the way she did when she needed her mind to work instead of her fear. Then she sat down. She sat down on a wide, moss-covered root and opened her notebook on her knee, and she began to speak. She used the names from the book, the ones she had practiced. Her pronunciation was imperfect, she knew that, but she had done her best with what she had. She recited the first name, then the second, then moved through the sequence the way the text described, keeping her voice low and even, the way the book specified, calm, respectful, without demand. After the fifth name, one of the wolves stepped forward. It was the largest of the three. It moved without sound, which should have been impossible given the dry leaves on the ground. It came close enough that she could see the silver in its eyes had depth, like water rather than glass. It lowered its head, and she reached out her hand, slowly, palm up, the way you might offer your hand to any animal you hope to gain the trust of. The wolf's nose touched her palm. That was the moment she heard the footsteps. They were human footsteps, and they were deliberate. Someone who walked like that was not lost, and was not afraid. All three wolves turned at once, and then, she would think about this later, many times, they dissolved. That was the only word for it. They became thinner, and then thinner still, and then there was nothing there but empty air and the pale trees. The man who stepped into the clearing was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Then she registered the expression on his face, which was not anger exactly, but something colder and more controlled than anger. He had dark hair and sharp features, and the kind of stillness that did not come from ease. It came from discipline, from long practice. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem that has appeared without warning, in a place where problems were not supposed to exist. "Get up," he said. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more serious than if he had raised it. She got up. His name was Calum Voss. She did not know this yet. She would learn it within the hour, and she would learn other things too. That he had led the Iron Veil Pack for 11 years, that he had earned his position through a combination of strength and intelligence, that the people here spoke of with genuine respect, and that he was not a man who did anything without reason. The decree that kept this forest closed was his. He had enforced it without exception. He told her all of this at the boundary of the forest, where he had walked her back with two of his people flanking them at a distance she could feel without seeing. He spoke clearly and without cruelty, but he was absolute. She had trespassed. She had broken a law that existed to protect both the living and the old things that lived alongside them. She was lucky, he said, that she was still standing. She listened. Then she said, "The wolf that came to me. The large one. What is his name?" There was a pause. A small one, but she noticed it. "What did you say?" Calum asked. "The spirit wolf. The large one with the deeper silver in its eyes. I used the names from the old text, but the book did not specify which name belonged to which wolf. I wondered if you knew." He looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn the names?" She told him about the book. All of it. The estate sale, the translation, the 2 years of evenings spent with dictionaries and fragmented reference texts. She showed him the notebook where she had recorded her translation work. He took it from her hands, not roughly, but with a certainty that made her feel she had already agreed to let him have it even before he asked. He did not send her away that evening. He told her to stay in the village. He told her not to return to the forest. Then he left, taking her notebook with him, and she stood at the boundary stones and watched him go, and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not quite fear, and it was not quite fascination. It was somewhere between the two, in the place where important things tend to live. That night, in the room above the bakery, she started a new notebook. She wrote down everything she remembered about the wolves, the way they stood, the quality of their fur, the depth in the large one's eyes when it had looked at her. She drew it from memory, working carefully, and the drawing that emerged surprised her with its detail. She had not realized how precisely she had observed it in those few minutes. 2 streets away, in the longhouse at the center of the village, Calum Voss sat by a fire and read through her old notebook from cover to cover. He read her translation notes. He read her research summaries. He read the passage where she had written, in careful handwriting, the 7th name, the most difficult of the sequence, the one that the elders of his own pack had told him was untranslatable to any modern tongue. She had translated it. Imperfectly, with 2 syllables slightly displaced, but the spirit wolves had come to her anyway. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. His second in command, a man named Oren who had been his closest friend since childhood, found him there at midnight still staring at the fire. "You are thinking about the outsider," Oren said. It was not a question either. People around Calum had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. She knew the seventh name, Calum said. Orin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not possible." She also saw Halveth. The silence that followed was longer. Halveth was the name of the eldest spirit wolf, the one his grandfather had called the first walker. Calum had seen Halveth twice in his life. Once when he was 9 years old, the night his father first brought him to the forest and taught him the sequence of names, and once on the night his father died, 11 years ago, when Halveth had appeared at the boundary of the forest and stood there for a long time, looking toward the village, before vanishing again. The elders said, Halveth appeared only to those of the bloodline, and to one other kind of person, though Calum had always privately considered that part of the tradition to be symbolic rather than literal. He chose not to think about it directly. Instead, he thought about her notebook, and her translation, and the 2 years of work she had done alone in whatever city she had come from, piecing together a language that should have been beyond her reach. In the morning, he sent for her. She came to the longhouse with her new notebook under her arm, and her chin at the particular angle he had already begun to recognize, the one that meant she was uncertain but would not show it. He told her she could stay in Ironvale. She could continue her research. She could speak to the elders who were willing to speak, document what they were willing to share, and compile whatever she came here to compile. Under conditions, he would determine what she could access and when. She would not enter the forest without him. She agreed. She did not look entirely surprised. "Why are you letting me stay?" she asked. "You don't have to. Your decree would justify sending me home." He looked at her. "Because you translated the seventh name from a book no living scholar has been able to read, and because Halveth touched your hand." She held his gaze. "Is that unusual?" "Yes," he said. "It is very unusual." He did not say anything more. She did not push. She thanked him, quietly and genuinely, and she left. He watched her walk back across the village through the longhouse window. She stopped once to look up at the tree line where the Valewood began, and he saw her face in profile, the way it went still and open for just a moment, the way people look when they are standing in front of something that moves them deeply and they think no one is watching. He turned away from the window and picked up her old notebook again. He had told himself that his interest was practical. The book she carried was potentially the most significant piece of recorded spirit lore his pack had encountered in generations. Her translation, flawed as it was, had produced results that should not have been possible. That was worth investigating. That was a reasonable justification for keeping her close, for watching her work, for the fact that he had read her notebook twice already. He was good at telling himself things. He had been doing it for 11 years. It was one of the skills that had kept him standing when the weight of leadership had pressed down on people stronger than him. He told himself it was the book. Across the village, Mara sat at the small table by her window and opened her new notebook to the first page. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the village. She wrote a single line to remind herself where she was in the work. Then she turned to a fresh page and drew Halveth again. She drew him more carefully this time, with the full time she hadn't had in the forest. She drew the depth of his eyes and the impossible softness of his edges, and the way he had lowered his great head toward her hand, as if he had been waiting, for a very long time, for someone who finally knew his name. She sat back and looked at the drawing for a while. Then she wrote underneath it, in small, careful letters, "There is more here than a book. I do not yet know what it is, but I think I am going to find out." Outside, the Valewood waited, quiet and patient and very old, and somewhere inside it, between the pale trees and the still air, something that had stood guard for longer than human memory, moved slowly through the mist, and was content. For now, the right people were in the right place. The rest would follow.